What tank is the best right now in Mythic Plus and which one is the worst? And you should never invite your group. Never do that, actually. That was a joke. All tanks are actually good because all tanks are clearing almost the exact same key levels this week, but we're still going to break them down, see why one of them is better than the other, and kind of try to understand the differences between these tanks in the hopes of kind of understanding how it works and what tanks maybe you would like to play. So we're going to start it off really quick with Blood Death Knight. As probably to nobody's surprise, Blood is probably one of the worst tanks at the moment. Now, I am saying worst, but we looked at the data, of course, at least the public one, and definitely tanks are doing 20-21s at the moment. I think they're kind of like failing / not timing 21s. But the actual logs that we have access to for the information are around the +18s. People are just not logging their top tanks. And Blood Decay is like one key below, I feel like, the top tank, so it's not that bad. However, it will encounter issues as Blood usually does, because it's usually the tank that falls on its fat ass the first because of how it actually works. It's HP yo-yos a lot more than any other tank, and we already know that from you know, experience or seeing our own Blood Decay in our own group. And you can look at this asset right now. This is from, I believe, a +17 Halls of Atonement, or might have been a +18 Halls of Atonement, where you can see that this is how a Blood Decay HP yo-yos. Now, the good part about that is that it can self-sustain quite a lot, and it brings the DK kit. But this is also a reason why it's so low, and because that kit conflicts kind of with Frost Decay, which is a meta spec right now. So there's hardly any situation where you need 4 grips instead of 2, and you need 2 back-to-back AMZs instead of 1, right? So it's a little bit overkill on the Death Knight utility, since if you're going to be pushing the highest of keys, you're most likely going to have a Frost Decay rather than a Blood. So it's not that valuable to have that Blood kit in your dungeons, hence why it's probably not going to get carried by its own utility. And the fact that its core design just doesn't really function for endlessly scaling content, doesn't really see it rise any higher, and it will never really will unless you just receives like a broken tier set where it just gets insane damage reduction, so that it doesn't really matter what type of self-sustain it has, because it just doesn't take any damage. But that's, you're not playing a Blood Decay at that point, you're just playing a super tanky class, insert name here. And that's a shame, because Blood is really cool, but that is the situation. For Vengeance, I do want to say something here. So Vengeance is going to be in S tier just because S tier tanks are clearing the highest keys at the moment. And Vengeance is not, let's say, the best S tier, but it is clearing keys equivalent to that. Maybe it's, let's say, the worst S tier spec. I could probably bump it down to A tier, but I just don't really want to, because Vengeance is just really good. In terms of its sustain and damage mitigated, it's above average, let's say, from all the tanks, which doesn't really say much because we only have like 6 specs, so it's very hard to compare with the rest. It does mitigate quite a bit of damage, and it does have a decent amount of self-sustain with, you know, all of the heals that you get from the souls. The good part about Vengeance is its kit, which is probably the best, if not second best, kits that you can bring from a tank in a dungeon, of course, with all the sigils, the silent sigils, the grouping sigils, which is Sigil of Chains, of course. And even if the damage is decent but not the best, you do have priority damage, since you will be playing Eldrazi for the most part, unless you just want to have some fun with Felskar, but Eldrazi is basically what's being played at the moment. And with Wounded Core, you just funnel a lot of damage into one target. Obviously, it cannot compete with Havoc's own damage profile, with Arcane's damage profile as well. And since Havoc is also kind of a meta spec at this moment, it kind of competes with it as well. But there are, thankfully, a lot more group compositions out there that don't feature Havoc Demon Hunter, so you can squeeze in a Vengeance Demon Hunter instead of a Havoc. So it's not the same situation as Blood, let's say, okay? So it's definitely way better, where even though it's kind of a tank that relies a lot on its own self-sustain, kind of like Blood, it doesn't take as much damage as Blood, but it doesn't heal as much damage as Blood. However, it does have a kit that can carry itself, as opposed to Blood Death Knight. Bear is also kind of in between. But I feel like the Bear class is being carried by a couple of really insane individuals, like Squish Vegan, which has been, I think, #1 or top bear in the world for years now. And I think that's kind of mainly it. There is probably one good reason why it is in A tiers, because the groups that run bears don't really run feral druids whatsoever, because you do want the Mark of the Wild and some of the bear, or let's say druid utility, not bear utility. Ursol's Vortex, Typhoon, remove curse and poisons. I mean, those are really good. You have the curses in Dawnbreaker that just absolutely shred. And since you're probably going to be running a bear in a physical comp situation, you're probably not going to have a mage for the curse dispel. You might have a shaman, but the shaman doesn't have poison dispel if we're talking about Restore Shaman at this point, although Shaman can dispel curses, so you still can fit a niche with it. Now, of course, it competes with Feral in terms of the kit that it's bringing, and you know, the Mark of the Wild, the Vortex, the Typhoons, and all of that. However, people just don't seem to be playing Feral in the top comps, even though Feral is really good. So it might actually be on a downfall right now if more people find places for Feral and replace Bear with something else. I mean, obviously, nobody's saying that you cannot have Bear and Feral in the same group, but overall, I mean, Bear is just the average depiction of a tank in terms of the damage that it takes. Its HP is not really scaly. It's decently tanky, but nothing to write home about. So that's usually where Bear is. Now, for Brewmaster, I actually expected this to be a lot higher, but it is also an A-tier spec. It is very close to S tier, but I don't think it's going to get quite there yet because I believe it's one of the tanks with the least amount of damage. Weirdly enough, because I think it looked like it had the most amount of damage going from PTR into live until it got a bunch of nerfs, and it's not looking like it's going to change since I believe most of its damage is coming from Master of Harmony, and you're not playing Master of Harmony, you're playing Shadowpan, since Shadowpan is a little bit tankier and you need that tankiness. Weirdly enough, if you look at this HP breakdown where you don't really see Brewmaster spike too much, but it's not as tanky as, let's say, the top tanks here. However, it is very consistent, and people have criticized Brewmaster for this because they got used to either healing Vengeance in last season or healing Prot Warrior now, where either the Prot Warrior HP doesn't move at all or the Vengeance kind of just handles its own self-sustain with its own healing. Brewmaster is not that. Brewmaster is more of an old school tank. You kind of have to constantly heal it. However, it's very predictable and it's very reliable. The HP, as long as you're playing properly, doesn't spike too much because of how stagger works. Of course, unless you, we're not talking about when you mess up your rotation. So because the HP doesn't spike a lot, yeah, you probably need to constantly heal it. Either have an Atonement if you're playing a Priest, or always put your Riptides or refresh Riptides on your Brewmaster as a Shaman, depending on the builds you play, or have Hots as a Druid on the Brewmaster, which has been a combination that has been praised for a long time since they really work. Stagger with heal over time just works really well. But if you can get past that, you won't have surprises. You obviously won't have the spikiness of Blood Decays and even Vengeance Demon Hunter on Brewmaster. The main problem is that its kit is not really that great for Mythic Plus. It brings Mystic Touch, which is maybe the biggest selling point, since there are physical groups composition that are actually pushing really high. Not the best, but like second best, like almost the same level, and you kind of want a monk. For instance, the groups that play Bear, and especially Squish Vegan's group, bring a Mistweaver, but with the Brewmaster, you can just leave the healer roll open for a Resto Shaman, which is arguably a better healer in my opinion. But that's where Brewmaster is at the moment. Decently tanky, not a lot of damage, which is probably why it's not going to climb any higher anytime soon. Prot Paladin. This actually has been the biggest surprise for me because I did not expect this. Prot Paladin is legit S tier. Better than Vengeance, statistically speaking. Of course, we only really looked at some of the top logs because, you know, if we go over like the top 1,000 keys cleared by Prot Paladin, sure, we might have some issues. But we looked at, let's say, the best Prot Paladin in Halls of Atonement, which is a dungeon notoriously nasty. Not as much for tanks anymore, but the tanks do actually end up taking quite a bit of damage. Now, Prot Paladin is surprisingly tanky. In this particular dungeon that we looked at, it ended up taking less damage than Prot Warrior, or at least you can be fair and say that it's comparably tanky to Prot Warrior, which is something that a lot of people find surprising, myself included, but the numbers are there. And I think it has slightly more self-sustain than Prot Warrior. It just doesn't have the damage of Prot Warrior. Also surprising fact, since Prot Paladin has been known to have some of the most damage output. However, there are a couple of things that Prot Paladin does better than Warrior. For instance, it can block spells now that Prot Warrior doesn't have spell block. And you're playing Faith in the Light, a talent that makes it so when you Word of Glory, you get block chance. And because you play Lightsmith now, and the Lightsmith kit just gives you incredible self-sustain with the Bulwark and the armaments and all of that stuff, adding Words of Glory that reduces the cooldown of armaments as well, and keeping your block up is a really nice synergy to keep you tanky. Now, I do have to say that Prot Paladin is one of the hardest tanks to play out there. So yes, we're looking at the top players playing Prot Paladin right now that are actually pulling this off because they're really good players. But if you try to trickle this down to your level, maybe like your plus 10s weekly or plus 7s, it's harder to pull that off, and it might make it seem that Prot Paladin is squishy when it probably really isn't. And it has the best utility kit in dungeon. I was kind of thinking of Prot Paladin when I said that Vengeance might have the best one, but realistically, Prot Paladin is maybe better because you have, I believe, Divine Toll is on a way shorter cooldown than Sigil of Silence, and you shoot out your Avenger Shield that just interrupt everybody, which has been a notoriously very good skill to have in Season 1 of The War Within when there were so many casts abound, which made Prot Paladin the top tank because it could just interrupt everything and bring everything back together in one neat little sexy pile. You have really good party assistance or support with, again, Poison Dispel, not Curse this time, but you do dispel poisons, which are very bad in Arakara and things like that. You have Blessing of Protection for the bleeds, let's say in, I don't know, the traps in Priory, those are really good. Freedom in Priory is also really good because if you use Freedom, you are actually immune to Suleiman's smash on the ground, thunderclap thing. Did you know that? Because that's actually a really cool Paladin tech that a lot of Paladins, or all of them, should use in Priory of the Sacred Flame. And I think Prot Paladin deserves to be here. It has all of the tools needed. It was just way too squishy in the past seasons, and if this is the season where Prot Paladin is tanky, I am happy for it. And we're talking about the big dog here. For the longest time, Prot Warrior has been in the shadow of all of the good tanks. Now, it's not an S+ tier as probably people would have expected it to be above the other ones. It's very close, or it might have been at the beginning of the season before people probably played more Paladin and more Vengeance to kind of figure out that they're actually decently close to each other. Prot Warrior is better than the other two, don't get me wrong, but it's not good enough where it deserves its own tier, at least not in our humble opinion. It is the tankiest tank at the moment, and it kind of deals the most amount of damage. However, its kit is not on par with Paladins and Vengeance, which is kind of why they're balanced a little bit like this. Yes, Disrupting Shout is really good to interrupt AoE casts, and that's why all of the S tanks are in S tier, I guess. And the fact that you kind of lost Spell Block, it puts a damper into how good you can be, but I guess they moved some of that tankiness into the other parts of the Prot Warrior kit since you are taking less damage than everybody else, maybe with the exception of the occasional Prot Paladin that plays slightly better, I would guess. But this is how the tier looks at the moment by taking a snapshot of Mythic Plus and the meta at one point in the season. Let me know what you think. Has this been your experience playing your keys with the tanks, and which tank has kind of, you know, pleasantly surprised you at how good that tank handled dungeons, whether it's through the mechanics, how good it survived, how well it impressed you with the knowledge of the dungeon and its kit? Let us know in the comment section down below. And watch this video from last week's tier set where we look at the DPS for Mythic Plus, because they kind of go hand in hand with tanks. So we have to break these down a little bit, otherwise it's just a little bit weird to have all the specs in one video since it takes forever to talk about this. Click it and watch it right here. Bye-bye.